I want to consider a few of the effects of my discovering of the hidden histories of 3 or 4 civilizations, because it's changed the world I see around me and how I understand the world. So let me just consider some of the deeper consequences of that work. One aspect of it is that I now understand the full force of history and the deep tendencies that underlie our lives. We like to think that we can create the world as we like, and that each generation can make it anew, and that some prophet can come and lay out a plan and we can start again, as many leaders have tried to do. But in fact, when you look, as I have done, at the degree to which modern Britain, modern Japan, and modern China are the continuations, the products of 1,000 years at least of continuous evolution and change, then you realize how much we are at some deeper level influenced. Now that is often, perhaps rightly, seen as a way of thinking which is rather conservative, because it says that altering things is really very difficult, and perhaps also that it's not a good idea to try and break away from your traditional patterns of your culture, as Ruth Benedict might call it. And that's probably true. I don't see myself as a deeply conservative person in either a small or big C, but probably there is a sort of drift to maybe in older age towards seeing the value of earlier things, and things which are easily on the surface brushed away are not really brushed away. So I now see the underlying deep note, as Maruyama called it, the deep structuring patterns, the habitus, which is there and doesn't greatly alter. More and more I suppose I see long periods of history in these civilizations, and probably others if I study them, more like Chomsky's deep structure, a way our minds, in his case, are formed, in my case civilizations are formed, where you have a grammar which doesn't basically alter. You can modify it a bit, you can add new vocabulary and a little bit of syntax, but really at a deeper level. It also ties up with the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss and his attempt to see the way in which all human societies think in certain, in his case, binary patterns and oppositions. Not necessarily that, but the idea that a civilization is a living thing like a human being, and while it'll change all sorts of bits and pieces, it also remains the same paradox, famous philosophical paradox of the ship of the Argonauts, which set off with a certain shape and a certain crew and a certain set of bits of wood and sail, and when it came back many years later, people said, well, is this the same Argonaut? The crew seems pretty different, the wood has all been replaced, the sails have been replaced, and yet it's the Argonaut, it's the same. Same with the philosopher's shoe, which was a shoe and made of lots of bits of leather and sewing twine and other things, and as bits fell off they were replaced. But it's the same shoe, it's the same shape. Same with my experience with Cambridge University, which when I read its medieval history, I can see it's still the shape of the collegiate religious teaching systems are still there generating the surface, but that surface is very, very different. So those are the sorts of understandings I have which help me to navigate my world, because when people are alarmed and panicking about how everything is lost and changed and so on, I can see that that isn't the case. There are dramatic times of upheaval, revolutions as they're often called, and for a time it looks as if almost everything has been thrown out, and then it tends to revert back to a more ancient pattern, and that's both reassuring, but it means that we have much less control over our destinies than we thought. A second set of thoughts concern what is becoming more and more obvious in the last 20 years, which is that the world is rebalancing. That is to say, up to about 1820, much of the economic wealth, many of the ideas and technologies were located in the East, that is in India and Asia, other parts of Asia, particularly China. And then happened in the last half century firstly with the emergence of Japan. In fact, that was earlier, but the great burst of Japanese economic and other growth in the second half of the 20th century, the Four Little Tigers and others, Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and so on, and then very dramatically, and making it so obvious in the last 30 years, the rise of China has meant that the pendulum, or the balances, which was the West and the rest, is now like this, and is going to switch to most of the wealth and power being outside Europe and America. That rebalancing is made more comprehensible by the discovery that our civilizations, all of our civilizations, are ancient, and also that rebalancing has to take account of the basic deep differences between civilizations. When it was thought, and I thought and everyone thought, that basically you had a pattern of history, a very simple pattern of history up to 1800, 1820, 40. The East was dominant, or at least the most wealthy, populous part of the world, but very backward, or getting backward relatively to the industrializing West. And the West had discovered wonderful things in terms of political systems, democracy and law and technologies and so on. And then that would then correct the weaknesses of the East, and gradually the whole world basically would become Western. Development, Westernization would be a global phenomenon, and these, as the Victorians might have thought, childlike, infant, backward, growing Eastern civilizations would grow up and become adult and become like us. So there was nothing really except to extend and expand the missionary message, not just Christian, but democracy and human rights and Western technologies and legal systems and educational systems, all that, it was our mission, our destiny to spread that over the whole world and to make the world wealthy and free. Now that assumed that you could wipe away civilizations, reorientate them, and move them in your direction, make them into democracies or whatever it was. One of the effects of thinking about the long and very different patterns in Eastern and Western civilizations is that that doesn't look either desirable or sensible or possible. We now know it isn't possible, that having absorbed a great deal of Western technology, the flow has all been more or less one way from the West to the East over the last couple of centuries. That flow of new technologies, new institutions, and ways of doing things has happened, but it hasn't wiped away the differences, and it's not going to. That these countries are going to be equal to the West, if not more powerful, and they are going to maintain their difference. And indeed, the rebalancing means that we may well return to a certain extent to the situation before 1800, which is that much of the flow of ideas and technologies and techniques and wealth came from the East to the West. We haven't really begun that process because we've arrogantly assumed that we can't learn much from such countries. We can admire their beautiful crafts and arts, we can admire their products, we can absorb their surplus wealth to build good lives for ourselves, but we can't learn much. And one of the shocks really is to think about the disparities of the East, India, China, Japan, and so on, have made a huge effort, a huge amount of dislocation and effort to absorb lessons from us. But what have we learnt from them about anything except a little bit of perhaps technologies or crafts, and little bits of philosophy and so on, maybe a little, but not much. But this is going to change, and one necessary background to such a change is to understand them. If we just continue to be largely ignorant of how these other civilizations work, we will either panic and say, they're trying to get at us, they're trying to change us, they're trying to infiltrate us, we must keep them out, which A is impossible and B is not desirable. Or we will just fumble along in the dark. So, although this is a very late part of my work, and I'm only becoming aware of it now, I want to at least point others in the future towards a recognition that we really must understand what we are and what they are, and then, on the basis of that understanding of the similarities and differences, then absorb what is beneficial to us. Because there is an enormous amount that we can learn about how the world can prosper and pursue peace from other civilizations. If you looked at the last 1,000 years from a Chinese or Japanese, Indian perspective, you would admire many of the things which they've absorbed and copied, the technologies and some of the institutions and educational methods and medicine and so on. But you'd also think, well, why have they been so aggressive? Why is Europe and America, why are they civilizations which are constantly trying to set up empires and conquer other civilizations? Why are they constantly at war with each other? Endless European wars and so on. Why do they spend so much money on weaponry? Lots of puzzles about this, the downside, the violence, the inequalities, the absence of thinking about the general good rather than the private good. So from outside, it's not a perfect solution that the West offers to them. And that becomes increasingly obvious as the world globalizes, because what the West did in terms of fighting each other and confrontational politics or law or anything else didn't necessarily affect you enormously, but until recently. But now we are all so interconnected that one small dispute in some part of the world can escalate through chaos theory and the butterfly effect to affect everyone. And when we are thinking now in terms of global challenges of disease or immigration or crime or whatever it is, then we have to think at a global level, and the solutions will not come from just one part of the world. They have to be worked out with agreement across the world. And in that work, many of the solutions that, for example, China has developed, holding together this vast civilization, a quarter or a fifth of mankind for a couple of thousand years in an empire, they've had to deal with social cohesion and how you get people working together in a way which is very difficult, but surely has some lessons for us, and how the Chinese Han have dealt with their neighbors, which has been mostly fairly peaceful tributary systems, and the basic ethics of Confucianism and Taoism, which are non-confrontational. All that may help in a new international global order. So we should learn about that. Another thing I've learnt from these recent thoughts on discovering civilizations is how it's helped me understand myself. It's often, I think, something that anthropologists find, which is that they don't understand their own society very well. And one of the many reasons for going a long way away from it is then to look back, to use the experience of going to some very different environment and civilization and looking at your own world in a mirror. Now, most anthropologists traditionally who did that went to some smallish, fairly isolated community, as I did in the Himalayas, and looked back from a Buddhist and Hindu and ancestor worship and shamanic world at Christianity, and saw it in a different light. Looked back from a world before the development of modern technologies and saw our own world in a different light. And that was the great contribution of anthropology in the first half of the middle part of the 20th century. But there's a limit to which the lessons taken usually from pre-literate, non-literate, non-industrial, small-scale societies around the world, there's a limit to which that can be taken, because you can, it's obvious that it's very different if you're dealing with such places and then you're dealing with America or Europe or whatever. The work that I've done on Asia, in particular Japan, China, I think is even better for helping as a mirror to our world, because it's clearly a successful set of patterns which have been developed in terms of bureaucracies and government and art and aesthetics and religious tolerance and many, many other things. It's worked, but it's very different. And so in each of these cases, you look at your own solution as not the God-given and only way of dealing with things. One of the reasons why you can't understand your own society is that you are trapped within it by believing that it is the normal, the obvious, and indeed the only way in which you can solve various problems. Obviously, you have to have a single God. Obviously, you have to speak English or an alphabetic language. Obviously, you have to have a democratic political system. What else could any sane person develop over the centuries? But when you have great civilizations elsewhere which don't do that, do something different, it throws in a relative light your own solutions. It doesn't discredit them, it doesn't say they're rubbish and should be thrown over, but it does lead you to see them in perspective, to see yourself as others see you, and that is another great advantage, because self-awareness is extremely difficult for all of us. And in particular, and here I'll end, in particular, I found looking at these civilizations and then looking back not only on Europe but on the Anglosphere, and my own English culture, not only in England but in America and Australia and Canada, has been extremely helpful. What it's shown up in a rather tragic way is the degree to which the West has lost or not fulfilled many of the dreams and hopes that you might have expected to come true if you'd looked at it, say, in the Enlightenment period, the 18th century. Because, taking the case of America, the founding fathers hoped to build a city on the hill, a city of light, a working out of God's providence, and they designed a constitution, a political constitution, a social constitution. They welcomed in people from all over the world. They built a wealthy and prosperous civilization, and America looked like the future dream, and from time to time it acted as a bulwark to save democracy from fascism and so on. And yet if you stand back and look at the post Second World War period and what all that promise has led to and where we are now, and you look at the state of America now in 2023, its educational system supposedly crumbling in many ways, both at school levels and university levels, its physical infrastructure crumbling, its economic system leading to huge instabilities and inequalities and probably a loss of dominance quite shortly, its vast effort to try and dominate the world through huge military expenditure, the constant wars which it has entered into in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in South America, and now in Europe, where each time it has spent vast amounts of money, caused untold harm and damage, and then retreated in failure. Now, how have we got to that state? How have we got to a state where American cities are so riven with poverty and violence and so on? Where is the American dream? And can something be done about it? Well, let's hope it can, and that American democracy, which seems on the point of being extinguished, can revive as Tocqueville believed it could. But looking at ourselves in the mirror of the eyes of the rest of the world, we increasingly see that we are not as wonderful and cutting edge as we thought we were. And so this work I've been doing is an exercise to a certain extent in humility, not in, hopefully, in self-flagellation, because I still have a huge admiration and love of my own country, and I've written a lot of books about the unique contributions of the English and their special virtues, and have been accused of being a little Englander and so on. So it doesn't lead me to hate my own civilization and want to replace it, but it does highlight some of its deeper defects, which are screened from me if I only looked at my own self from where I am. But looking at myself through the eyes of others and seeing the weaknesses, the hidden injuries of my world is, I think, helpful. So those are the few of the things that I would hope will come out of this work.